How do you do it? How do you get to Gothic purpose, the essential animating motive behind the Gothic by way of Walpole? Well, one way to do so is to take a close look at Theodore in Walpole's Castle of Otranto, who I will be calling Theo throughout this PowerPoint video. He's the hero of the book, if it has a hero. Doesn't have a hero. At the end of the book, Theo is all dressed up in knightly gear. Looks a lot like Alfonso. You will recall he's taken for Alfonso by Manfred, and it kind of freaks out Manfred when he sees him walk in armor and feels that the statue of Alfonso has gotten off its pedestal and walked into the room. He's all dressed up in knightly gear, isn't he, at the end of the book, with no place to go? He doesn't get the reward so often reserved for the hero of an old heroic text, one which, in fact, would have it has knights do good things, has them do potent things. They get rewarded. He doesn't get those rewards. He doesn't get the woman whom he prefers, Matilda, who has been killed by her father, you will recall. Moreover, he's not given a chance to do anything heroic at the end, so as to prevent that event, so as to save the woman he prefers, the woman of his dreams. Bereft of Matilda, he reluctantly accepts, you will recall, Frederick's offer of his, Fred's own daughter, Isabella, only, quote, after frequent discourses with her, the result of which discourses is to make of her a partner with whom to, quote, forever indulge the melancholy that had taken possession of his soul. Well, that's not the ending most heroes enjoy, and one is apt to wonder, accordingly, if the Gothic is not an anti-heroic genre to the extent that we accept the premise of this entire discussion, which is that, in fact, if we have a Gothic novel looking for an example of the Gothic, it would have to be that inaugurative text, the Castle of Otranto. Well, wisely may one wonder if the Gothic is not an anti-heroic genre. It was, in significant measure, the Gothic that gave rise, as we will be seeing, in English literature, to the very idea of the anti-hero, the Byronic hero. We will, I bet you've encountered that phrase before. We will be discussing the Byronic hero in good time, and we'll be meeting with some Byronic-looking characters sooner rather than later. In this book, it's really Manfred more than Theo. Next week, it will be a monk named Schedoni, and a little while later, it will be the monster in Frankenstein, when it's not Victor Frankenstein himself. But wait, yes, Theo was denied a chance to be a good knight, and the would-be good knights of the book do not save the day. Well, they don't save Matilda's remaining days. But that Theo does not turn out to be a good knight does not mean that he cannot be a good prince, a good ruler, a good shaper of his community or society's future. At the end of the book, he is left melancholy, as we have seen. He's also left in charge. And there's every reason to think that his values, as well as his ways and means, will direct the destiny of his immediate world, as well as all those who occupy it. So if the Castle of Otranto is any indication, then, one good purpose of the Gothic may be unearthed by studying the values, Theo's values, that are allowed to triumph, if that's the word for it, unheroically, somberly, even melancholily at the end of the novel. Which are So a point worth dwelling upon is this point. Manfred, unlike the upstart, Theodore, not. He's no upstart, as it turns out. We find out by the end of the book. Manfred is lordly, yes, masterful, but not knightly and chivalric. Is Theodore knightly and chivalric? It's a question that arises, but let's go on. A surprisingly crucial episode is that in which Theo, who has already revealed a nature characterized by jealous, I keep wanting to say jealous, generous gallantry. For example, he's assisted Isabella's escape from Manfred, whom she views as a sexual marauder, is carried by Matilda to her father's armory and equipped with a complete suit of knightly armor. This is a scene that you might have felt was pretty kind of silly or just throwaway, right? Really not all that crucial. I think it is in a certain way, as maybe we will find out. So outfitted, Theo, in the conventional apparel of gallantry and chivalry, his so far latent and muted nature now erupts, right? The jealous gallantry of his nature now erupts. He throws himself at Matilda's feet, you will recall, seizes her, quote, lily hand, kisses it, and asks her, quote, permission to swear himself eternally her knight. Now, that's a very conventional thing to do if you happen to be a knight in an old romance. If you aren't, Theo isn't really, then it's a bit silly. By the time this book was published, you should keep in mind the romance genre of knights and damsels and exotic heroic adventures had already been mostly discredited. Cervantes' Don Quixote, for example, published in 1612, 140 years more or less before this book was published, makes a lot of fun of romance. Okay, and this scene here in Walpole, I think you would agree, is faintly comedic, faintly satirical. A thunderclap interrupts Theo and Matilda, just as Theo's earlier and sudden declaration that he will fight on behalf of Manfred, Manfred's being the father of Matilda, and he wants Matilda, so he fights on behalf of Manfred. He's promising to do so. You will recall that he and Matilda were having this conversation in that moment, hear a deep and hollow groan, which they both attribute to pent-up vapors in the castle. And it's difficult for me to imagine that that's not a joke. Okay, the castle passing gas, as if to make fun of the solemnity of the moment. Okay, the comedy, it seems to me, is apparent, but we should not allow that to dictate to us precisely our response to the scene, because there is a serious point being made here that Theodore, despite being a bit ridiculous in these moments in which he cops a kind of chivalric knightly attitude, he's no poseur, he's no posturer. He is indeed courteous, gallant, chivalric, and all the rest that we want our knights to be inwardly, right? And he is warmly, passionately so. You know, sometimes a little bit too passionately, right? Sometimes this warmth boils over into, quote, hot-headed passion. That's what his own father says about his behavior on occasion. Theodore is in possession of the generous sentiment at the heart of chivalry. That's the point, a core sentiment that Walpole values, even as he chuckles at this very young man's sentimental and conventional expressions of it. We should also bear in mind that the novel set earlier, indeed at a time when people did put on armor to fight, even if they did not go through the other routines of conventional literary romance. As the Nick Groom, the author of the introduction to the book, the Oxford World's Classic volume of the book, or edition of the book that I'm hoping that you have in your possession, writes, quote, the novel set in Italy in the late Middle Ages, just before the English Reformation, which is, you know, the era in which Henry VIII broke with the Catholic Church and instituted what we now call Protestantism. So, even as we chuckle at Theo's chivalric manner, we need to respect, I would argue, the core values it expresses as a worthy alternative to Manfred's cold and selfish mastery. Manfred, I don't think I even need to make this case, and you will see that I didn't write it out as part of this plate. Manfred lacks that internal core sentiment of generosity and especially of anything gallant. I think you would agree. There's just very little consideration for others as he goes about what he sees as his own self-interest, right? And he's not a good example. He's not someone who has kept up the chivalric, either in manner or in matter, in internal emotional disposition. Now, just a little more in the novel's treatment of the chivalric theme. Notice how Theo is contrasted not just with Manfred, but also with Frederick. Whereas when you put the two of them together, and they're actually a little closer together thematically, I think, and if not in their characters, in what they're, in the plot, and what they're attempting to do, they kind of pair up. Each one wants the other's daughter, you will recall. Theo is contrasted with Manfred, just as he is with Frederick, or with, shall we put them together in a composite, Manfredrick, because of course they share that Fred between the two of them. Well, better deserving of a deep and hollow groan, I would argue, okay, is Frederick, who comes to lust after Matilda, thus betraying his own chivalric values. His own chivalric values, I guess I should say. By the time he conceives this unchivalric desire for Matilda, one significantly and maybe not surprisingly, instigated and promoted by the distinctly unchivalric Manfred, he's already been slightly mocked for, of all things, chivalric excess. The chivalric excesses of his entrance. You will recall that two-page account of the herald and the brazen trumpet, which precedes the the numerous members of his entourage who walk in this kind of very romancy moment in the book, and highly chivalric when it comes to the routines and rituals of chivalry, right? The outward show of chivalry is very much in evidence in that moment. Now, he turns out to be one of the good guys, does Frederick. I think you would agree by the end of the book, right? If also one of the guys who ought to stay away from the young, ought to stay away from the young women, without quite giving up entirely on Matilda. He has a difficult time doing that, and I think that's in part supposed to signify just how desirable Matilda is and what a shame it is that she cannot have a life. We know what happens to her at the end of the book, that she cannot have a life for herself, which gives us a very strong sense of just how bad the thing is that was done by Manfred's ancestors, right, or ancestor, that it should, down 2 and 3 generations, it should have this baleful effect, this deadly effect upon the family, as it turns out, right, that usurpation. So without quite giving up entirely on Matilda, the very attractive Matilda, it's understandable and is even kind of tragic that Frederick can't, nevertheless, I think you would agree, renounces any association with Manfred, and in a sense is very close to renouncing Matilda herself. You will recall that just before the climax of the story, he pushes Manfred aside, rudely it's said, enters his bedroom and bolts the door against him. He doesn't stay up late partying with Manfred, excuse me, and discussing with him, or kind of contemplating with him, the future possession of the other's daughter. Okay, he doesn't want any part of that. And of course, he's already had that visit from the skeleton by this point. But if Theo must renounce what his father Jerome calls his, quote, guilty passion for Matilda, then it's clear, so that sacred vengeance may work its will. We could get into the details of how sacred vengeance will work its will by destroying Matilda and Manfred's family, more or less, right? So must Frederick renounce his, I would argue, yet guiltier one. If Theo has a guilty passion, Frederick has a guiltier one. And if either one of them wants to emerge from this morass, this immoral morass of Manfred's making, a lot of M's there, but I think you get the point, they need to renounce a passion for Matilda that cannot, no matter how desirable and wonderful Matilda is in herself, cannot but be a guilty one. Okay, and that's really more of a description of Theo's situation than Frederick's, because I mean, what's guilty about his passion is that it's purely sexual, right? And it has very little to do with anything chivalric or anything good in any kind of larger way. It's as selfish as anything that Manfred exhibits, any desire that Manfred exhibits, but in some ways kind of baser, and kind of pettier. Manfred at least has this, I mean, it's colossal evil, of course, but he has this larger view that extends beyond himself and his own pleasure and extends to his family, right? And in some ways, the last thing I'm going to say is that, excuse me, Frederick is a worse character than Manfred. I don't believe so, okay? Remember, for being, he's a shallower character, could we put it that way, right? And you will recall, it's better to be shallow when it comes to being damned. If you've read Dante, you will know that, excuse me, those who commit sexual crimes, as opposed to those who commit more spiritual crimes, are damned less painfully, okay? And they tend to occupy a sphere, a level that is higher in hell and not lower. You want to be higher in hell, not lower. In any event, for the greater part of the story, Frederick is in Manfred's and the unsuspecting Matilda's power. And it takes that visit from a skeleton to unfix him, you will recall. The point is that Theo is paired with one, right, Frederick, not just Manfred, but Frederick, Frederick, The point is that Theo was paired with one, Frederick, who was even more truly chivalric outwardly than he is himself. You know, Frederick owns his own armor. He doesn't have to visit somebody else's armory to get some armor. And he is indeed a knight of long standing. You will recall that Theo, for all of his moments of armor wearing and whatnot, has not become a knight. Now, as it turns out, by blood he is a knight. We find that by the end of the book. But he's not one of these knights with all the manners of the chivalric knight, and he doesn't have much of the show. He's kind of like a fairly, with respect to knighthood and knightly routine, he's a Johnny-come-lately, and you get the feeling he would need to go to knight school, no pun intended, if he was really going to become a knight, right? Start the sentence over. Theo is paired with one, Frederick, who doesn't need to go to knight school. He is truly chivalric outwardly, but he lacks a steady commitment to chivalric values. Again, I don't think Frederick's a nasty character. He is courteous, and it behaves in a way that looks a little bit like Theo, as though he could get along with Theo, who is an authentically chivalric person, has the values, the deep values that animate all of the knightly routine, but are, in the case of Theo, maybe a little bit separate from them, right? In the case of Frederick, they certainly are, because Frederick, though he does some of those things, or rather feels some of those things, and observes some of those values, and puts them in action, some of those values that we associate with the authentically chivalric. Well, can you make more of a mistake as a knight than to lust after a beautiful woman? Okay, that is just simply not something that you do. What you're supposed to do as a knight is dedicate yourself to the preservation of the virginity and chastity and choice of the woman to whom you dedicate yourself. And I think you would agree in accepting Manfred's offer of his daughter, Manfred's own daughter, so that he, Manfred, can get Frederick's daughter. That's, Frederick is scarcely observing authentic internal chivalric values. So it's no wonder that Walpole has Theo, you will recall, readily defeat him in a contest of valor. The combat was furious, but not long. The point being that the new chivalric way of Theo, you have the values without necessarily the show, proves more potent than the old chivalric way, where you have, as it turns out, maybe it's the old chivalric way has just gone the way of all such, where you have the chivalric show without the values. This new chivalric way, that new chivalric way, endorsed then by Walpole? Yeah, I think it is. And I think something else is endorsed thereby that I'm going to call the way of the Whigs. One of the purposes of the Gothic, as revealed by close attention to Walpole's novel, is to advance, I would argue, and I'm not alone, a Whiggish view of the world. A what? You probably heard about the Whigs or heard of the Whigs. A Whiggish take on society, the individual, history, nature, God, and so on. A take which we do not have time to study at length as an end in itself, but which we can indeed talk a little bit about, as we now will. Most historians would agree it was the Whigs who brought the Gothic into prominence as a literary as well as a broadly cultural mode. Walpole, the author of The Castle of Otranto, was by all accounts a hardcore Whig, which is to say he was one of those English who intellectually and politically, quote, deliberately opposed the monarchical crypto-Catholic despotism of Tory royalists. That is, he is what we today call a progressive. Though, I want to do so with a certain misgiving. You should resist, I would urge, too easy an aligning of our own and past ideological binaries, right? The Whigs of Walpole's day were to the Tories of that day very roughly, okay, I want to put the emphasis on the roughness of this analogy, very roughly as today's progressive Democrats are to pre-Trumpian, old-fashioned establishment Republicans. Okay, so it does break down that way, very roughly speaking, that the Whigs were like the Democrats these days, okay, especially the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, roughly, very roughly, you get a little bit of a sense of what they were after, what they were about when you make that equation, but you should not be married to that equation. Don't feel that in setting it up in your brains according to this contemporary binary that you have it solved, because there are all kinds of qualifications, okay? And the situation back then was a bit different. As situations go, right? They tend to be a little bit different one from the other. But what did it mean to be a progressive at that time, a Whig? Well, you were given over to a hatred of tyranny and, quote, all autocratic forms of political order associated with the Romans. These things made the Whigs seize upon the historical Goths, by the way. Where did this Goth thing come from? Where did the Gothic? How does that come in, and why did the Whigs like it? They seized upon the model provided by the historical Goths, the members of the various Germanic tribes that fought the Romans, and who indeed fought for their autonomy against the, quote, imperial hegemony of ancient Rome. These were their models, okay, of how to deal with tyranny and autocracy, right? You know how that goes. It's so often, don't we need some kind of, almost mythological, certainly historical kind of figure to associate ourselves with and maybe use as a symbol, right, or an emblem of our movement. And what the Whigs did, and some folks actually were doing this already before the Whigs got a hold of the Goths, they seized upon the Goths. I know when we think of the Goths, these days we think of like people we knew in high school, maybe ourselves in high school, right? Who dress a certain way, but in the past, the Goths, were the actual peoples of the North, the cold North, who, we do at times remember, don't we, that, hey, they were the ones who sacked Rome and initiated what we now refer to as the Dark Ages in 400 AD. So they don't necessarily have a good reputation, but they were kind of rehabilitated by the Whigs of Walpole's day and some others who preceded the Whigs as perfect emblems of an anti-tyrannical and anti-autocratic resistance to autocracy, tyranny, as represented by the Romans, right? And the Brits loved this kind of a thing. Certain members of the British polis did, the polity, right? Who were the sorts who were, for example, they'd done this a long time ago. This particular side of the British character had already created Parliament, right, a long time back. But this was the side that wanted to limit the power of the king and wanted to limit the power of any outsize figure who would impose his or her own individual way upon, the polis, the polity, the public, right? Does this make sense? The purpose of the Gothic generally, moving down to the fourth paragraph, would be to work against extant and contemporary forms of tyranny and autocracy, especially forms that feature tyrants and autocrats, large singular personalities that would carry all before them and would do anything to stay in power. Hey, isn't that Manfred? He would do anything or almost anything to stay in power. Yes, he's humbled in the end, but up to that point, he's shown himself willing to pursue what in the 18th century would have been regarded, maybe here in the 21st century would be regarded, as a semi-incestuous marriage with Isabella, who has become virtually a second daughter to him and has been taken into the family, practically legally adopted, right? And to that end, to the end of acquiring Isabella, so as to preserve his line, right, by having a son with Isabella, as he hopes to do, to throw away the wife he now has, to trade away the daughter he now has, to refuse to mourn his dead son, to condemn to death anyone who gets in his way. You'll remember at least twice, if not three times, does he condemn Theodore to death. And it doesn't happen, thankfully, and refuse above all to right the great wrong of his being in power to begin with. He is just a archetypal example of an outsized, immoderate individuality that the Whigs evidently distrusted and feared, even paradoxically as a valued individuality, right? And individual rights, individual human rights, universal human rights. And we're very much the kind of folks that, for example, our founders had a lot of respect for. Thomas Paine, who was very influential with Jefferson and Ben Franklin and folks like that, was very sympathetic with the Whigs, right? So you have that little bit of a paradox there, but you get it, don't you? It's, you know, on behalf of a general individuality that you oppose radical individuality, right? You know, Manfred, to repeat, is an outsized and moderate individual that the Whigs evidently distrusted and feared as likely to create tyranny. It's likely to impose in seeking its own will on the wills and even the basic liberties of others. So some interesting things are explained by all this, and I will just mention one here. I think I've already explained a few things by way of it. The opposition, most generally, to Manfred that we have in the book. Also explained by those considering Castle a Whiggish work is the anti-heroic fate afforded, or potentially, as we have seen, quite heroic Theodore. Theodore is not allowed to triumph in the old, not so progressive ways. The premise being that in so winning out, he might get a taste of what it's like to be Manfred, and might, in so doing, be tempted to take a step in the Manfredian direction. The Whig Walpole absolutely hates the idea of deposing one tyrant and replacing him with another. That would hardly be very progressive. Well, speaking of progress, I've kept you long enough in this video. I think we've made some progress. Nevertheless, we are now done.